finally, to wrap it all up, we'll have Dr. Edward Fuller, and he'll be talking about principals and teachers. And Dr. Edward Fuller is an associate professor in the Department of Education Policy Studies at the College of Education at Penn State University. His research interests include educator, that's teacher, principal, and central office administrator quality, distribution, mobility, turnover, and career pathways, educator preparation, school improvement, evaluation, and charter schools. He serves as a director at the Penn State Center of Evaluation Education Policy Center, PCEPA, and the associate director of policy for the University Council for Education Administration. PCEPA provides evaluation assistance to schools, school districts, and reorganization in the Commonwealth across the nation. I did have a title, but yet if you could potentially have switched it. Is it the same presentation you're going to be doing? The title of it?
Yeah, close enough.
Okay, it's the recruitment and retention of rural school leaders and teachers. And so without any further ado, let me actually set up the PowerPoint.
I'm actually going to focus more on teachers since Andrew did such a fantastic job with leaders. So it's great to be back in the South, which I appreciate now, living up north where it's cold and miserable sometimes. Only about 4 months out of the year. So I'm going to talk some about recruitment and retention, mostly of teachers. I'm going to, the previous two presenters have looked at the data a little bit longer and done a more complete examination. So I got down here and then we kind of decided, well, maybe I'll look at something different. So I ran some data yesterday, and so it's a little sketchier than the previous ones. But I think I'll bring up some points, and at the end of it, I'm going to talk about what some proposed solutions are to this issue. But I'll tell you right now, there's no evidence that any of them work because none of them have been in place long enough for anybody to do any serious evaluation of the efficacy. Oh, there it goes. So, 4 sources of data: Texas Educator Employment, because Andrew and I worked on it. Pennsylvania, where I am now, I got the data there. State Educator Equity Plans, which all states had to submit in 2015 to the USDOE, and then of course the anecdotal information from which I likely overgeneralized because that's what we do, right? So I'm going to look at retention. So I'm going to look at some in Pennsylvania, some in Texas, and then move into the educator equity plans. So here's beginning teacher 1-year retention by Pennsylvania locale, and this is a project that Andrew and I are working on, and the funder, Center for Rural Pennsylvania, doesn't include suburban as a locale. You're either urban or you're suburban, and even their definition of who rural and urban are is a little strange, but that's how we've done it. So I need to go back in and put the NCES locales in, but this is how we're doing this report. We're doing a report on teacher supply and demand. So for rural, across all these are the 4 cohorts where I feel comfortable that we've actually identified beginning teachers. You see rural, there's a higher retention rate for rural teachers. And if you look at all teachers, in fact, there's a higher retention rate for all rural teachers in Pennsylvania. And I think this is probably going to be the case even when I put on a different, however you want to identify rural schools, I think you're going to get this will be the case. Once you get them there, they don't leave. They'll stay a long time. The problem is, can you get somebody to fill a position in your rural district? That's where the problem is in Pennsylvania right now, which is dramatically different than in the past, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so then I used the magic statistical machine, and I did a logistic regression analysis of beginning teacher attrition in Pennsylvania for those same cohorts. But here I'm controlling for personal characteristics, so age, whether the person is female, whether they're black, and in Pennsylvania there's not enough of any other race or ethnicity to hit a large enough sample size, so I had to collapse it, which I hate to do to other teachers of color. So our reference group is white teachers, which is, I think it's 94% of teachers in Pennsylvania are white, which is unbelievably ridiculous given that it's way different than our student population. But in rural areas, it's like 98% white. It's completely, there's almost no diversity in rural areas. Years of education experience. Oh, and this is all teachers, this is not beginning teachers. And then squared because you're more likely to leave right at the beginning of your career and at the very end of the career, so it's a quadratic. District enrollment, whether it's a high poverty school, salary, and salary here is adjusted by the comparable wage index, and the comparable wage index, and I think this is an important thing for us to talk about in rural areas. What that does is says, so here's your average teacher salary. What would you be able to make, what do other college graduates make in your same area, same labor market? So if you weren't you're a college graduate, if you were not a teacher, what would you be making? And in most of the rural areas in Pennsylvania, you make more as a teacher than you would in some alternate occupation that requires an undergraduate degree. I'm coming to the conclusion that, okay, yeah, that's true, but is that wage that you're going to offer somebody to try to entice them to come to your district, that's better than an alternate occupation, but is it large enough to get somebody to actually come from outside of your labor market into that labor market and take that job? Because we hear teachers complain of a lack of amenities, like some of it's, and I'll talk about this later, there's no place to shop, there's no place to go out to eat. Like even in State College was just, there's 100,000 people when the students are there and 50,000 people when the students aren't there, and then there's 200,000 people when there's a football game. So, but there's hardly, you can go to all the restaurants in 2 weeks and then you're done. Like there's no more new restaurants. In Austin, you could spend 2 years and you maybe hit all of the restaurants, maybe. It's just different. In State College, it's a big town in central Pennsylvania. So there's a lack of some amenities. Also did some controlled for whether you're in the Philadelphia metro area, where there's a lot more attrition and churn. Same with Pittsburgh. And then whether you're in a rural district. And then charter schools almost always have higher churn of everybody, so I controlled for that. And so what I found is, yeah, high poverty schools, your odds of leaving are much higher, which is consistent with all the other research. Your salary, the higher your salary, the less likely you are to leave, which is consistent with all the other research in this area. And then in a charter school, you're way more likely to leave, which is consistent with all the other research in the area. But if you're in a rural district, the odds of leaving it isn't any different than if you're in an urban. And even if, I think if I add suburban in here, it might be like suburban teachers probably stay a little bit longer. But once you control for things, there doesn't seem to be an effect of rural districts. Although, one of the things we were discussing this morning as we were meeting is what's just part of being a rural district. So if you control for salary, salary is a really important characteristic of a rural district, right? They tend to offer lower salaries. Once you control for that, then okay, what characteristic of a rural district is having an effect here after you've controlled for the very important fact that they offer lower salaries? So it's a little tricky about, okay, what variables do we put into the equation, what do we not put into the equation? So that's something I certainly want to discuss. So now, Texas data, and so again, using the same data set that Andrew has, except we're looking at teachers now. This is the logistic regression, so odds ratios for 5-year retention for beginning teachers. So this is only beginning teachers. What's the odds they're going to stay in the profession for 5 years? And I did it by school level, and I didn't do the previous one by school level because I didn't have the data in when I ran it the first time. I've since done it, and it doesn't really change anything. But doing it by school level is really important because the odds of leaving vary pretty dramatically between elementary, middle school, and high school. So if you're not controlling for that, sometimes you get some weird results. And what I did here is, and this is one of the things I want to do with the principal data with Andrew is, so I took the urban core. So there's really 5 major metro areas in Texas. There's Dallas, there's Fort Worth, and there's really not much in between those, so that if you've been there now, you drive and you like, I can't tell that I'm in Fort Worth or Dallas. It's one giant megaplex. there's San Antonio, in Austin, and there's almost no distance between them anymore either. And then Houston. And what has happened in Texas is, so you have these urban core districts. And generally, it used to be like the first ring, the districts that were right next to it or adjacent to those urban core districts were affluent and white. And what happened since 2000 is those first ring districts became poor and minority in terms of student characteristics. And it's the next ring that is now affluent and white, and now that's even morphing into, well, it's more mixed in terms of student diversity and poverty, and it's the next ring that is more affluent and white. So what we're seeing is a movement out of affluent white families, and at some point, and we're starting to see, so now we're starting to see some affluent white families are moving out, but others are moving in, and so they're starting to see gentrification of the major metropolitan areas, because at some point you're too far away, you don't want to drive in, and we have no mass transit in Texas. Like, we don't believe in trains, we don't believe in subway, we don't believe in get in your car and drive, and if it takes you an hour and a half in traffic, that's what we do in Texas. So we're starting to see a gentrification. And then, so this is, the comparison group is when you're outside that fourth ring. So you have a district, first ring, second ring, third ring, and then outside of that is really rural. That's the comparison group. So if you're a beginning teacher in an urban core, you're statistically significantly less likely than that fourth ring, so rural teachers, to stay across all three school levels. In that suburban ring one, at elementary and middle school, you're statistically significantly less likely to stay, but it's not a huge difference. The odds, the difference in odds are not huge. The next ring, it's only statistically significant at the elementary level, and again, the difference isn't huge. But at the high school now, if you're in the suburban ring, you're more likely to stay than rural. And then the next ring out, so that's adjacent to the rural, you're more likely to stay at middle and high school than the rural. And so that's probably rural moving in, because you're going to get if you move into that suburban fringe, you're going to get a pay bump, but you don't have to fight the traffic to get into ring 2 or ring 1. Because if you're fighting traffic, you're probably losing money on gas and time, because trust me, if you drive in DC, that's what Austin and Dallas and Fort Worth, and it's like driving in DC. You just sit there and go 5 miles an hour for an hour. When you use the locale codes, you get similar findings, except in rural. So in some cases, it depends on your comparison group, but oftentimes rural teachers are more likely to stay than other teachers in other locales. So I'm still trying to figure out like what's going on. But some of it contradicts the national data that Richard's done, and even the national NCES data, where they just take, it's from SAS as well, where rural teachers are a little more likely to leave. It's not clear that that's always the case in Texas or in Pennsylvania. So state locale, state context matters when you're looking at this, and even what we're going to do, Andrew and I are going to do in our paper, is drill down there's different types of rural areas in Texas. So if you know Texas, along the southern border, it's Mexico, and so that whole area is called the Rio Grande Valley, and it's almost 100% Latinx. I've done qualitative studies down there. You go down there, it's almost 100% Latinx. There's not a lot of alternate occupations other than teaching where you're going to get that kind of salary in benefits. I mean, you have banks and grocery stores, and that's your alternate occupations. There's really high unemployment. We looked at it this morning. And a lot of the teachers are first generation college goers. And so one of the things Andrew and I found out in other studies, and another graduate student of mine at Penn State has found, is Latinx teachers, regardless of what they teach or where they are, but particularly when they're in the Rio Grande Valley, are far less likely to leave the profession than other teachers. So their retention rate's really, really high. It doesn't matter how you cut it. like Latinx teachers stay at higher rates than white teachers or black teachers. So one of the things we're going to look at is there's rural predominantly Latinx districts, there's rural predominantly white districts, which tend to be at the very top end in the western part of Texas, where it's agricultural, where you're running cattle on just flat land with grass, or you're in West Texas where the alternate occupations are you help drill for oil. But those are largely the only alternate occupations. So there's differences in rural context, and that really hasn't been looked at. And so that's one of the things we want, you can do in Texas because it's so giant, and there's so many different rural areas and urban areas and suburban areas, so we can start to disentangle and see the differences between those contexts and see how that plays out in terms of teacher retention. So supply, and I'm going to go back, this is national data, this is from Title II, and some of it's probably not 100% accurate because it's self-reported from teacher preparation programs to the state, and then the state sends it in, and there's directions, and we all know what happens when a bunch of people read directions, and not everybody pays attention, right? So sometimes they're a little sketchy. In blue is Pennsylvania. This is the percent change in teacher preparation program completers. And so I took the average of 08, 09, 09, 10, and 10, 11. So rolling 3-year average to kind of smooth out any policy changes. And then the average to 14, 15, 15, 16, 16, 17. What's the difference there? So for almost all states, we see red, declining completers. Same with I have another graph. With enrollment, same thing. We just see a few states. The states that have new increases are Massachusetts, North Dakota, Utah, and Virginia. And South Carolina is where, since that's where we are, we ought to look at that one. It's right in the middle. Oh yeah. So it's about a 20% decline. So massive declines in Pennsylvania, so we've lost almost 50%. There's been a 50% decline in completers. So the ratio, one of the things we've done in our study is the ratio of newly certified teachers to the number of teachers who are hired in each of the subject areas has gone from like 4 to 1, so 4 people prepared for every 1 person hired, down to slightly more than 1 person prepared for every 1 person hired. And so while districts are finding somebody to largely, in most cases, they're finding somebody to put into a position, this goes back to Peter's, you see declining number of applicants. Like, so I've interviewed some rural superintendents, and what they've said is, yeah, I hired somebody, but we had 4 applicants, and I took the best out of that 4, but that's not really who I wanted, but what choice did I have, right? You gotta put somebody in there, what are you gonna do? Your other option is emergency permit, which you hate to do, because now they're not even certified to be teaching that subject area, so you pick the most qualified person you can get, but that might not be the person that you really want. So that's kind of what's going on. It doesn't show up in any real shortage indicator. As people think of shortage, like I can't fill the position, but it's really difficult to fill the position with somebody who you want to fill that position with. Recruitment, one of the things, and Peter talked a little bit about this, is where people are prepared at influences your supply of teachers who are going to apply to your district. So this is my own, I made 9 regions because we don't really have regions, so I kind of just made up what I know about Pennsylvania, which isn't a whole lot because I've only been there 8 years. But you have Philly in the lower right-hand corner where Richard is, and then you have Pittsburgh on the left-hand side, and most of the rest is pretty rural except for the Philly suburbs. But highlighted in yellow in the northeast section, there's only 3 prep programs, and they're all rural. Oh, I'm sorry, there's 3 rural and 8 urban because that's where Lehigh is. It's really not that far from Philly. But in the north central, if you drive in the north central, you don't even get cell phone reception. Like you're just driving through the forest and you're like, wow, are there people living up here? I don't know. There's 3 prep programs and 2 of them are on that right-hand line and the other one is on the left-hand line and there's none in the middle. So they don't, like, where do you get your teachers if you're there? The central, there's 10. The largest one is Penn State, and we produce the most teachers in the state, but less than 20% of our teachers stay in state. We get a lot of people from Virginia and New Jersey and New York because our tuition is ridiculously high. And so we get some, relatively affluent families send their kids to Penn State, and then they go back to Northern Virginia, New Jersey, New York to teach. The Southwest region, 4 prep programs, they're mostly in that little jutting up there. And then Pittsburgh has some. So you'll see the impact of this in the next slide. So this is the number of secondary math instructional 1 licenses. So this is beginning people who have their initial teaching certificate. We have instructional 2, and that's after you, after 3 or 5 years, you're supposed to go to instructional 2. You complete so many credits or something. But essentially, you're moving off of a probationary type of certificate to a full master teacher certificate. But look at the North Central. 7 people came out of prep programs in that area with a secondary math. There's more than 7 openings for math teachers in that area, which I have in another slide, but I didn't put it in here. The Southwest, 4 people got a math certificate. There's more than 4 openings. So what they're having to do is what Peter talked about, is they're having to reach beyond their traditional labor market to go recruit people. And that gets increasingly hard because what do they know about living down there? In the Southwest region, actually it's a coal country, but there's no coal left. And so the towns are getting smaller, declining enrollment, there's no other job opportunities. So even if you're a young kid coming out of college and you're wanting to move somewhere, you can drive to Pittsburgh and go do something, but if you don't drive, there's not a lot to do for somebody who's 23 or 24. If you're married with a spouse, there's not a lot of job opportunities for your spouse either. So it makes it difficult. Same with the North Central area. So there's lots of impediments for them to reach out and try to recruit somebody into those areas. So that declining preparation that we saw in that one graph is hurting those areas the most. You still kind of have an oversupply in Philly, although it's hard to get somebody to teach in Philly for a lot of different reasons. But the suburbs, the other areas of the state, there seems to be a relatively ample supply. It's those rural areas that are really getting hit hard. Emergency permits, so this is an indicator of if you can't find somebody who's certified, you go to emergency certificates. On the left-hand 2 columns are the number of teachers, and we see declining for both rural and urban. And in the emergency permits, we have declining teachers, but dramatically increasing number of emergency permits from 2012-13 to 27-18. A 70% increase in rural areas, all rural charter rural. CTC is career and technical centers. In IUs are intermediate units, so like in Texas, they're education service centers, and then I think in New York they're BOCES or something. I don't know what they're larger geographic areas where they try to help districts. They will hire teachers and then contract them out to districts, particularly in rural areas. But for all rural areas, we saw 70% increase in the number of emergency permits. Urban, however, it's almost 150% increase. Which kind of contradicts my previous statement about supply. But there's just a lot more teachers there. And you have a lot more charters, and charters are way more likely to hire somebody on an emergency permit. You see they had a 417% increase in number of permits. So overall the state, a lot of places are just resorting to emergency permits, including rural areas. The only thing that's saving rural areas in Pennsylvania is, and Andrew did a great job on putting the data together on this, is their enrollment's declining, and it's going to continue to decline through the next decade. And so you don't have to hire new teachers unless somebody leaves. You're not hiring teachers because you have more students, because you don't have more students. If they were gaining in students, there'd be a massive, unbelievable shortage, and these numbers would be a lot higher. Everybody's losing students except for just north of Philly where you're gaining some, and some around Pittsburgh as well. I did a non-random low response survey. We tried to survey all the superintendents and principals in Pennsylvania. I can't remember how many we got back, but I mean, it's certainly not a high enough response rate to say, yeah, this is generalizable. But it gives you a sense of the people who responded. There were big differences between their responses about, this is the percentage who said that finding teachers in these areas was difficult or very difficult. So at the elementary school, ELL teachers, which there's almost none of in Pennsylvania, there's a huge difference. And then and then special ed. At the middle school level, a lot of special ed, foreign language, computer science, pretty big differences between rural and urban. And then high school science, the traditional shortage, what we typically talk about, traditional shortage areas, math, science, special ed, ELL, and then economics. You see big differences between rural and urban. So I wish we had a higher response rate, and I feel more comfortable saying, yeah, I can generalize this to everybody in Pennsylvania, but we can't. But the evidence that we have is like, yeah, there's pretty big differences in terms of the ability of rural superintendents and principals to attract and get somebody to come in and fill positions. So solutions. Yeah. Good luck. One of the things I did is, so I read all the state equity plans. I didn't read them all. I took them all and I searched for rural, which wiped out 26 of the states right away because it said 0 or it said 2, and I went to it and said, oh, this person was the director of the Rural Education Center at some university or something. But they didn't, 26 states didn't even mention like there was a rural teacher recruitment issue or anything like that. By the way, like 49 of the states didn't mention rural principal issues at all. Most of them don't talk about principal recruitment or retention issues, period, and only 2 touched on the idea that maybe rural areas were having a harder time getting principals. It contradicts a lot of the data that we see out there. It's like state education agencies. In the way they develop these equity plans, they had to. The USDOE said you have to bring in a bunch of stakeholders and hold meetings all around your state and gather input from them and then write up this. You have to identify root causes and then you have to identify solutions. So they brought everybody around the state together, but 26 states didn't even mention rural. And some of these were like states with lots of rural schools. I'm like, okay, they didn't even identify it as a problem. Another 21 states mentioned very little. They just said, well, yeah, there's a difference in access to experienced teachers or something like that, but they didn't really talk about it. They didn't identify any root cause. They identified here's a solution. They're just like, yeah, somebody at one of the meetings mentioned it as a problem, but we're not really going to talk about it. And then 4 states really got into it. So South Dakota, which you would expect because it's really rural, but North Dakota didn't. So South Dakota wins that battle. Washington State, Vermont, and Arizona all dealt in a substantive way, like the issue of, hey, we have a problem with rural recruitment or retention of teachers. Here's some root causes. Here's what we're going to try. Even those 4 states, though, weren't able to say, hey, we tried this, we know this works, and we're just like, okay, we're going to scale it up to across the whole state. Nobody had identified any solutions where they're like, yeah, we know this works. It was all, we're going to try this, and we're going to try this, and the superintendent said, this would be a good idea. Nobody had any concrete evidence. So solution-wise, I don't have any solutions to tell you, but in these slides, these are what people mentioned in those equity plans, as well as some of the rural superintendents in Pennsylvania. But number 1, salaries, right? You pay people, you offer higher salaries, you're more likely to get people to come to your job and stay at your job. One of the things that they talked about in Pennsylvania is do future teachers in Pennsylvania. In Texas, they have future teachers of America. So it's that grow your own. One of the things we talked about though is that's not gonna solve your problem. That might help you a little bit, but you're never gonna grow your own out of your problem of recruitment. It'll help, but it's not gonna solve the problem. That's one strategy. So one of the things that has worked in some places, there's some evidence that would work, is guaranteed free college if you do 3 to 5 years of teaching. We were gonna do this in Texas, and then the comptroller's office that does all the financial stuff and like would have to do all the logistics of it, where it's like, that's a great idea, the legislature was all ready to do it, and they're like, it's too hard to do, we're not gonna do it. Like, it just logistically, they didn't wanna like have to do all the computer matching and try to send people checks and stuff. They're like, And I'm like, that's a really terrible reason not to implement a policy, because it was too much work. Loan repayment for X years of service. Now the federal government promised that they were going to do this, but if you haven't heard, they actually didn't fulfill their promise, and they're rejecting 99% of the claims. Like, I taught, and so you get to pay my loans off. The federal government's actually not fulfilling their promise on doing that. But if you did that, it seems like you would get people to go in. One thing though on the guaranteed free college, so Penn State has a noise grant, and they have gone to rural districts and said, hey, if you come and you want to be a math teacher, we will pay for all 4 or 5 years, whatever it takes, of your schooling at Penn State, which is well over $100,000 a year. And then you can go be a math teacher. And they leave money on the table. They can't get enough people to, if they don't get a whole lot of money to do this, they can't get enough people to come and do it. Full ride at Penn State to over $100,000, they can't get people to come and do it. One of the things, it was really interesting in some of the statewide plans, I remember particularly Arizona, and I read another one, they're like, one of the problems is we've bashed teachers for like the last 10 years, and that was probably a mistake, and it's probably drawn down our like, number of people in our teacher prep program. And I'm like, well, yeah, probably true. Yeah, you shouldn't talk badly about teachers. That's not gonna increase your supply. So doing some positive things. And in Texas, they have a cost of education index that funnels additional money to districts for the purpose of ensuring. The idea is like every district has the amount of money that it takes so that everybody has equal chance to hire the same teacher. So rural districts get more, high poverty districts get more. It's a section of the school finance system. The problem is they did it in '88, they've never redone it, and so it's way out of whack. But originally it served its purpose well and made it more competitive for every district to recruit people. So I think that's one. Good luck getting it through the legislature, but because it costs money, but it actually seems to work to some degree. This is more along Pennsylvania, but in Pennsylvania they give no flexibility to the prep programs, which makes it really hard to develop courses that would prepare you specifically for rural areas. So it depends on the state. We don't have very many alternative programs. Texas has a ton, but most of them are really bad, and people from alt-cert programs quit at way higher rates than people from traditional programs. But there are ways to do it in a high-quality manner. And so that's one option, like a state like Pennsylvania, where you need to ramp up like special ed and math teacher production pretty quickly. Testing fees, it's really, it was not expensive to get my certification in Texas back in '89. It's really expensive now to take all the tests you have to take to get into the teaching pathway in college and then get your certs. And if you don't pass it the first time, then you have to pay again, and then you pay again, and then you pay again, and then as long as you take it. So I worked at the state, and in 2001 we had somebody take it 56 times, and it was something that I'm like, dude, you spent like over $5,000 taking certification tests, man. Maybe you ought to like quit. But it's a financial hardship for a lot of people, particularly prospective teachers of color who may have come from they've taken out loans and they might not have the family background. So that's a potential. And then retention, mostly it's about money and improving the leadership, because leadership is what retains people in schools. And then some of the same ones. So we got 2 minutes for questions, 3 minutes.
I have a question, Dr. Fulmer. So
Yeah.
for your slides so your slide on recruitment, you have a slide on recruitment and certification and retention. So on the recruitment slide, you said that's sort of a summary of some of the strategies that were in the state equity plans, right?
Yeah, yes, correct.
And then what about the certification slide and the retention slide?
Certification was mostly from my discussions with people in Pennsylvania, because it's real specific to how they run certification in there. And then retention is a combination of the state equity plans and then what I've read in the research in terms of retaining teachers. And a lot of the state equity plans would go to the research and say, this is research says, retention bonuses or more salary or improving school leadership helps retain teachers.
Thank you.
Ed, you didn't have Alaska up there for an equity plan thing, and they've been dealing with this forever.
They don't mention rural in their plan.
Right, it just occurred to me, like, can we learn anything? Like, they have been dealing with this, like, they fly their football teams places so that they can play games.
Right, because they're 300 miles apart. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Is there anything we can learn about? I mean, I know they pay a boatload of money to import teachers, like a
Yeah, their average teacher salary is really high.
But I feel like there's my read of the research is we never see Alaska featured.
No.
And can we learn something from what Alaska's done and what works? And
I have a student doing her dissertation on this. I'll make sure that she reads the Alaska plan and see what we find.
All right.
Because I didn't actually read it because it didn't say rural. So I'm like, oh, okay. But maybe it's just so rural, that's just their plan is, because we're rural for the most part, here's our plan.
I don't know,
So
you
that's
also have
a
to
good
think
idea.
about how those equity plans were actually written.
I'm sorry?
You have to actually think about how those equity plans were written. And then the transition that happened they're not necessarily written by researchers. They're written by people in departments of education.
Right.
Generally speaking, what you do is you talk to the few states next to you, or you go to a few meetings and
Right.
try to come up with something within the timeline.
Right. Well, they have to go out and talk to stakeholders, and they were supposed to summarize the state.
Just saying.
I worked at a state education agency, so yeah. They actually, and this is why USDOE said, you have to hold meetings, you document your meetings, you document all the participants, so you go to the South Carolina plan and it'll tell you who was invited to speak and discuss, be a participant in the meeting, and where it was, so you can see, who was there. So it would be interesting to go and look and say, no, that didn't really happen. Like, I don't know,
Another part of it is how you're defining rural.
Yes.
How a state perceives that. And they may, like in South Carolina, we talk more about high poverty areas than we do about rural. Some people would argue that the whole state of South Carolina is rural. So, a lot of it I think has to do, like I was surprised that South Carolina didn't show up on the list of the ones that spoke substantively.
Yeah.
But I think we talked a lot about high poverty areas,
Right.
critical need areas, all that kind of stuff. So we might not have used the word rural in the way. we
Right,
should.
that's a good point. Same with like North Dakota and
Except for the one in Columbia.
in Wyoming. I mean, if you're all rural,
Well,
Right.
I mean, we do have a program to funnel funds to districts with high turnover rates. And we call it the Rural Recruitment Initiative, but it really doesn't even have anything to do with whether you're rural or not. It has to do with whether you have high teacher turnover rates.
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
just all,
we needed to, and that's why the student's doing the dissertation, because I'll have her go through and read a little more carefully than I did. I just searched on rural, so.
Yeah, and I think, not that I'm saying anything, I just am recognizing some of the contextual issues on those state equity plans, but,
Yeah.
part of it is that trying to create a plan when you know that you have all of these factors that are playing into this, and that's actually gonna make something happen is very challenging.
Yeah, the plans are,
So, you know,
Yeah.
but, you know, 6 of one, half dozen the other.
plans are a little sketchy because you don't want to commit your state to like, yeah, we're going to do this, which I understand, because maybe you don't have the money. But identifying the root causes, one of the 4 states did this whole fishbone exercise where they went through and identified all the root causes for rural problems with rural recruitment and retention. And I'm like, wow, they took that seriously. Like they really had a discussion about what the root causes were for both recruitment and retention.
Which state was that, do you remember?
It was one of those 4, I can't remember. I think it was Washington, but it was one of those 4. And so it's really interesting to read that. And then they proposed some solutions, but again, they probably held back a little bit because, I mean, you don't want to commit to stuff that's going to cost a lot of resources when you have no idea whether your legislature is going to give you enough money to do any of that. So, yeah, the
Or
solution
how
part.
much control does a state have over what districts do or do not do?
Right.
And I will say that fishbone exercise was actually provided to all states by the CCSSO. Yeah, so anyway, it's interesting.
One thing I will point out that, and which was pretty staggering, is that in North Carolina, they gave some rural districts, teachers, math and special ed and another type of teacher, $1,800 extra, which sounds pretty minimal, but it increased their retention. So you could target specific types of teachers in specific types of districts and not spend a whole lot of money and maybe increase. That, and in Texas, we did what's called the Text-Best Mentoring Program, and it was roughly $2,000 a teacher, which is a lot of money because there's a lot of teachers. But the difference in, even we did a within school analysis, people that participated in Text-Best and did not, the ones who participated in Text-Best were much more likely to stay 1, 3, and 5 years. And so the cost savings for keeping somebody was pretty significant, and the cost savings was greater than the expenditure you had on the mentoring program. But then the recession hit and the legislature's like, well, cut, right? And then it's gone. So, you know, that's what happens with states. They cut stuff that works, and then you're back to where you started off with. So.
Quick question for any of the presenters. Do you guys know of any recruitment or retention strategies that have been causally linked with a positive outcome?
That one, the one that I mentioned in North Carolina,
Is that
is the one that I would
like
be the
staffing
most.
bonuses?
Yeah,
So it's primarily the financial.
yeah. I've seen finances pretty plausibly, causally linked. And then mentoring. Yeah,
Yeah, there was a randomized control study, a very expensive one, of induction for beginning teachers. So that gets at the causality issue, and they showed that beginning teachers that got comprehensive induction support for 2 years, their students did better, significantly better in both math and reading. So, you know, that's a strong study showing support for, I guess it's your top
yeah.
bullet
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, I think there's pretty solid evidence that if you do it the right way,
Yeah.
it's probably worth the cost, and you'll see an increase in retention. But you got to do it in the right way. You can't do it cheap. And
Yeah,
just,
and that's the
you know,
same
fly
with
by.
financial bonuses, because some people have said they've done what they're supposed to do, and they didn't need the money, because the district simply have the money to pay you. And then they
Right.
said they quit.
Yeah.
So back to the earlier question, these solutions to retention, this is for rural school retention, or this is in general?
It's more-
You
it's-
got these from interviews, or?
Most of this is for research, and some of it's somewhat specific to rural, but mostly it's general, like how to just retain teachers. None of the state reports really focused, outside of targeting money specifically to beginning teachers in rural areas. Nobody really had a specific solution that addressed rural areas. It was just money. If you targeted money to those types of schools, that would be a solution.
So these are from those state reports, but also from your reading of the literature?
Correct.
Because I would add that we do have some strong data showing that improving some working conditions is strongly linked with improved retention.
Yeah.
And that's important because improving some of these working conditions, like salaries, or class size, is very expensive. But there's other ones that, they may not be easy to do, but they don't cost big money. I talked yesterday about the whole input into decision-making by teachers. That's maybe not easy to do, but it doesn't cost, it's not nearly as expensive as increasing salaries. So we do have some data showing that some things are strongly linked to improve retention.
Yeah, that's why, I mean, one of the things is you have to give the survey to know, I mean, well, you don't have
That's
to,
right.
but that survey can be really helpful because
Diagnosis.
principals' perceptions of what they think is going on in a school is completely different oftentimes than the perception of teachers about what's going on in the school. So principals need that feedback and then say, I need to provide more autonomy, more decision-making autonomy to teachers because I thought I was doing it and they're saying, no, I need to talk with my teachers and figure out how to do that better. So yeah, I think that's a strategy, a pretty low-cost strategy, yeah, to improve retention. And then work with principals on like how to do that, which is again, pretty low cost relative to the strategies of let's give them more money and
Yeah, well,
fund
class
mentoring
size.
programs, right?
Class size reduction is very expensive.
Extremely expensive, yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't do much always for.
Because you gotta hire a whole lot more teachers.
Yeah, where are you gonna
And
get
there are no
them?
teachers.
And
Given the current shortage, I mean,
And structurally, you gotta have the room for that many more teachers in classrooms.
Right.
right, it's expensive for a lot of different reasons, yeah.
And rural schools end up having that anyway, typically.
Often,
Because of
yeah.
declining enrollment.
Yes.
As their students tick down, they try to hold off letting go of teacher as long as they possibly can,
Yes.
which results in fairly small class.
Yeah,
Unless
that's-
they close schools and bus kids for 2
Right.
hours to get to another school.
Yeah,
It's a whole different ballgame. Yeah. Nobody wants to close schools. Five
So-
kids.
okay, well, thank y'all so
Thank
much.
you very much.